And Courtney, thanks so much for inviting me again. Thank you guys for attending. And I wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible, but with the luxuries of technology, when they work, we can do this over Zoom. So thank you all again. I'm happy to kick off this quarter's community conversations as it relates to culture. I believe the theme is cultural connections, and I know we have a great slate of speakers. I think folks are going to be talking about all sorts of things related to culture, poetry, sports. I think I remember seeing one of the titles related to culture and gun violence. So I think it's just going to be a fascinating series this quarter. And what I'm hoping to do is, as the title might suggest, is just kind of kick things off with a little bit of a broad outline of sort of what culture is, particularly from an anthropological perspective, sort of what do anthropologists think about this concept of culture, because certainly over the years, that term culture has sort of made it outside of just the field of anthropology, where it's such a central topic and has been throughout the course of the development of anthropology, but it's sort of moved outside of that particular academic field into other academic fields, but even more broadly into sort of popular language usage in everyday life. So we see that term used in different ways depending on the certain contexts in which it's being used. So I was hoping that just to kind of give a general outline of the culture concept as it sort of is viewed, generally speaking, by anthropologists. Certainly, I would never claim to speak for all anthropologists. So, so here we go. Before we get started, hopefully we can get a little bit of audience engagement here. I'm gonna ask you guys to take part in a quick poll, just to kind of gauge the audience and see what you think about the question, what is culture? So when you think of that term, that word culture, what few words come to mind? And so this is just a poll everywhere poll. You can access it through the web right over here on the left, or you can, if you have a phone, you can just text. First, you would text Trey Batey 067 to this number right here, 37607. And then you can just type in a response, send it, type in another response, send it, and type in one more response. I think I set it up to be able to record 3 responses from any one individual. So if folks want to maybe just take a minute to send in their responses, and we'll sort of take a look and see where folks are in terms of what words come to mind. And I would just say, it's not allowed to use the word itself. So you're not allowed to actually send in the word culture, because that doesn't count. And Courtney, if you could maybe just maybe just even in the chat, or if you just kind of give me a note when it looks like maybe folks there are done, or maybe I'll just give it maybe about 30 seconds or so. Okay. All right. So hopefully some folks have had a chance to respond. I see nine results so far. Give it just maybe a little bit longer. We'll see what folks come up with. Okay, thanks, Courtney. People are still typing. Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and take a look at the responses. Right, what did we have here? The magic of technology. All right, so what we have here is, we've got our basic word cloud here. I didn't mean to do that. So we have our word cloud here, and you guys can see some of there may be some themes here that folks were entering, right? So I imagine a lot of you guys are familiar with this type of visualization. So the more frequent the entries, they're going to be larger font toward the center. The only thing is a lot of times these the algorithms that are creating the visualizations, they don't do well recognizing whenever two entries are virtually the same. So if someone wrote tradition, or you see traditions, ellipsis, and then traditions, because those obviously could be combined, but the algorithm isn't quite the best at that. But we have some concepts here, some things that you guys think about when we think about the word culture, right? So traditions, behaviors, rituals, ceremonies, norms, mores, values, learning, stories. This is great. I mean, all these things, belief, food, right? All of these things are part of what we would call culture. So just to, let's see here, if I can, there we go. So those were some concepts that you guys came up with respect to culture. I just want to share, this is a really well sort of within the field of anthropology, very well known definition of culture. So this one was written by E.B. Tyler, who's pictured here. Tyler was largely a 19th century early anthropologist, like sort of as the field of anthropology was really kind of in its infancy and being developed. Tyler doing most of his work in sort of the second half of the 1800s. And he came up with this definition of culture in his book, Primitive Culture, in 1871. So culture is that complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So you guys can see here that it's really expansive. And it includes a lot of the things that you guys had mentioned in responding to that poll, right? But really, really broad and expansive. Any other capabilities and habits acquired, right? And so it includes so much that sometimes it can feel a little bit overwhelming. A little bit later, we'll take a look at a couple more definitions of culture toward the end of at the end of the presentation, and one that sort of is a callback to the title of the slideshow. So what I want to do now is just sort of walk you guys through some of the features that anthropologists often think of whenever we're thinking about this phenomenon of culture, right? This thing that seems to be if not entirely unique to humans, maybe the scale at which we see it, something that it definitely seems like it's unique to humans. So the first couple things are that culture is both learned and shared. So we aren't born with culture, right? Culture isn't something that is innate to us, right? We learn it from social interaction um, with our social groups, right? Both our primary social groups like friends and close family and friends, and then also our secondary social groups, right? Whether that's peer groups or colleagues, right? So those other larger, maybe not quite as personal social groups, right? Um, and it's also shared, right? But we acquire this through that process of socialization, that we all are are sort of immersed in, especially when we're younger, right? During those years of growth and development, when we interact with other individuals, whether when we're interacting in social group settings, right? We're picking up on social context, social cues, ways of behaving that are acceptable, right? And expected, and all of those things, right? So things like, why do we pray a certain way? Why do we speak a certain language? Why is it that we have certain habits of brushing teeth and other folks might have other habits of brushing teeth? While certainly there are, some psychological explanations maybe for some of those idiosyncrasies, um, an anthropologist would look at sort of cultural explanations for some of the broader patterns that we see, right? Um, so again, this is something that we acquire through interaction with other human beings, right? We wouldn't say that an individual person um, like has culture, right? Culture is something much like society, right? For society to exist, you need more than just one person. We would also say that culture is something that requires, almost by definition, groups of people, right? And how do we learn, right? How do we learn our culture? It happens, again, through a variety of ways, right? So, we do things like, imitation, right? Where we directly imitate something that we see. We engage in play behavior that may imitate or model behaviors that we see. Um, Especially with humans, not only do we do things like imitate, but we also, and this is maybe something that is maybe a distinction with respect to sort of the scale of culture, um, maybe something that sets humans somewhat apart from our non-human primate relatives, especially the other living great apes today, in that humans have this capacity for teaching and learning, which is again a really important way that um, culture is transmitted. So when we look at aspects of culture, particularly human culture, which is what we're focusing on, it seems that there are some aspects that tend to be sort of relatively universal when we look across human groups, right? So things like the presence of kinship systems that sort of govern relations, right? That sort of let us know who our relations are. Things like and depending on what that system looks like and the rules around that kinship system, that ties into things like marriage rules, right? Um, but again, that's going to vary from one group to the next, right? We have variation in what the specifics of those kinship systems look like, right? Things like mortuary behavior, celebrating weddings and births, language, humor, games, play, art, music. While these things vary from group to group, and even within groups, sort of defined groups of people, um, it's the fact that we see these elements um, across human groups, that which is why we sort of tend to think of these things as cultural universals, right? But it's not just sort of these universal aspects of culture, but certainly there are sort of peculiarities within culture, right? And this sort of gets to an aspect of that idea that culture is shared, but at the same time, uh, anthropologists would recognize that when we think about sort of the culture of a group of people, which sometimes that's not even the best way to think about culture, but if we were to do that, um, we would recognize that not all people within a group all share all aspects of that culture exactly the same. So even within a group that we might consider to share a culture, there's going to be variation within, right? So not everyone is sharing all aspects of the culture 100%, right? So this little graphic right here by one of my favorite comics, XKCD, illustrates a little bit of that, right? And this is something that anthropologists have sort of realized very early on in the 1930s. Ralph Linton, who was a cultural anthropologist, um, sort of kind of highlighted this, that even within sort of cultures that we might be trying to define as belonging to a group of people, there's going to be variation within there, right? Culture is something that's dynamic, right? It's not just something that's static. And sort of along those lines, we can see ways in which culture sort of operates at different levels within society, right? So there's variation there. So we might talk about aspects of what sometimes is referred to as high culture, right? So not exclusively, but oftentimes aspects of high culture might be behavioral patterns that tend to be seen more frequently among segments of a society that have higher statuses, right? And when we say that, we're really talking about social and economic status, right? Or we might be talking about something that's a little bit more available to the masses, right? Something that we might call pop culture, right? Again, sort of readily accessible and available by sort of, the general populace. Of course, we have even within, that larger, broader culture, there could be sort of like these smaller elements within that, right? So something that we might call a subculture, right? We have a picture of some Trekkies here, right? Obviously, it looks like they're having a fabulous time at a Star Trek convention, right? But this particular group maybe shares, aspects of behavior, values, norms, interests that maybe aren't shared sort of outside of the group, right? So it's sort of culture within a culture. And then, of course, something that what we might refer to as counterculture, right? So these might be sort of movements or elements within a broader society that run counter to or contrast with sort of the prevailing mainstream norms of behavior within a society, or attitudes or values. The other thing that anthropologists would certainly point to is that culture is symbolic. So much of our interaction with other individuals and groups of individuals happens through the the interpretation of meaning, or the interpretation of symbols and extracting meaning from those symbols. And when we talk about what those symbols might be, we could really be talking about a wide array of things, right? So when we talk about symbols, we would be talking about, for example, language, right? Language is simply a symbolic system of communicating information, right? So this graphic right here just sort of is a little bit of a funny way. I usually show this to my students when we're talking about language and culture, sort of the arbitrary nature of language, right? We have these certain symbols, and for speakers of the English language, these symbols represent certain sounds. Those sounds are put together and strung together in certain orders, right, to make meaning. Well, if we take a different language, there are going to be different sounds that are strung together in different orders and put together in different ways to also make meaning, right? But again, it's the arbitrariness of those symbols that is sort of one of these defining features of culture, and in particular here, language, right? There's nothing necessarily intrinsic to the letters D-O-G put together in that particular order that would necessarily mean that thing that just probably popped, the image that popped into your head just then, right? It's completely arbitrary, right? Because if we take a different language, it's a different set of sounds and different letters that mean that same thing, right? And again, we can look at things, again, maybe not specifically with spoken language, but with things like gestures, right? So a simple gesture like this, depending on the context in which you're using it, the cultural context, the social situation, and maybe where you are, it might have completely different meanings. The next thing is that culture tends to be patterned, right? So again, it's not only shared among members of a community and maybe society, even if imperfectly, right, but generally shared. But we can also, we tend to be able to pick up patterns, right, in those behaviors, attitudes, values, norms, beliefs, and those types of things, all these things that we tend to encompass within this broader concept of culture, right? So like morality and values, again, beliefs about, what's true and what's not true, what's real, what's not real, um, and even mundane sort of everyday, things. Um, One of the anecdotes that I like to share with my students has to do with an experience I had with hand holding. I don't know, if any of you guys have maybe traveled different parts of the world. I know in particular in parts of Africa and the Middle East, hand holding, platonic hand holding between heterosexual male friends, it's really common, and that's just sort of the norm in those places. And I remember the first time I traveled to Jordan, that was just something that I wasn't prepared for. And the first time that one of my Jordanian colleagues, kind of scooped up my hand as we were walking down the sidewalk, it kind of, took me aback a bit. And, if you guys have heard the term culture shock, I experienced a little bit of that, right? Sort of, I kind of had a physiological response, I kind of felt flushed, and, the hair stood up a little bit, and I was like, what is going on here? But, kind of like went with it. And, by the afternoon, it kind of all clicked, right? It's like, okay, well, that's the norm in this place where I am now. So, again, we see these patterns across space and time, and that's just another way that anthropologists can look at this particular phenomenon. So patterns. This one relates to language. Some of you guys may have seen this before, but I do want to let you guys do another one of these little polls here. So what will you guys, how would you guys respond to this one? So what's the generic term you most often use when referring to a sweet carbonated beverage? Some of you may have taken similar quizzes of dialect like this before, but let's see what folks have to say. So far, soda is in a clear and commanding lead here. Okay, a little bit of a change. You guys feel free to keep responding. I just have a feeling that soda, it's going to take a big swing here for soda to be unseated as the favorite here. So mostly we've got soda. Yes, Courtney. Obviously, nobody from Atlanta, or dare I say the South, because if they had been, they would clearly know that that is called a Coke, right? So thank you guys for responding, and I'm just going to go ahead and advance the slide just so you guys can maybe see some broader patterns sort of across the country, right? So we're looking at kind of a geographic distribution of dialect here. So mostly soda. Let's see if this will advance. There we go. Okay, so thank you guys again for your responses. This is, when we're talking about patterns of culture, right? We can look at something like distribution of dialect with certain words, either word choice or pronunciation. A lot of times that has to do with the pronunciation of certain vowel sounds in words, or the number of syllables that folks pronounce words with. So here's the distribution. This is from a unfortunately no longer available interactive dialect quiz that used to be hosted on the New York Times's website, kind of their data visualization offshoot called the Upshot. And I used to have my students take this dialect quiz all the time. It's no longer available, which is such a bummer, because after you took the quiz, it gave you your most similar dialect and least similar dialect maps. But here you guys can see sort of how that's distributed across geographic space, right? So strong soda here on the West Coast, East Coast. Really interesting, sort of what's going on here around I guess that's like St. Louis, and then up here around, what is that, Milwaukee, maybe. Some strong soda users there, but then again, like Courtney mentioned, down in the South, everything's a Coke, right? And then it's just what kind of Coke. Maybe it's a Sprite, I don't know. Often, and soft drink tends to be another popular one in the South as well. Right, but we can look at these patterns in some particular aspect of culture as well. Right, and again, we can kind of look at these broader patterns and see how they change over time. Often, or at least in the past, you know, anthropologists in sort of the mid part of the 20th century, we're looking at sort of these larger patterns of cultural traits. Really well-known anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict did some really interesting studies trying to sort of better understand sort of broader cultural patterns sort of across nations. So sort of like national level sort of personality traits. And the next thing is that culture is integrated, right? So it's an integrated system into other sort of domains of life. And I just wanted to show you guys this image right here. This is sometimes referred to as the barrel model of culture. It's just sort of a way that you can think of sort of how culture and its different elements operate in our lives. So, here we have sort of the base level of that barrel is the environment, right? So one's immediate environment is going to be sort of dictating a lot of other things sort of within this system. So depending on the particular environment, that's going to sort of affect the economic base or the sort of the mode of subsistence, how individuals are acquiring sort of the basics of survival, particularly things like food. On top of that, this infrastructure lies the social structure, including sort of social organization, those patterns, how individuals are arranged sort of within a society. Certainly in a society like ours, which is hierarchical, right? So we have a structure of classes within society. And we talk a lot about that in my classes when we talk about social stratification. And then on top of that is the superstructure, right? Sort of this aspect of sort of the prevailing worldviews, perceptions of self, society, and then how we tend to view the world around us, right? And then all these things are sort of feeding into one another. And then I think this is maybe the last component here is that culture is adaptive, right? And really, this is what I want to highlight is that culture is really kind of the premier non-biological mechanism that we have for human adaptation, right? If we look back into our deep past and look at something like tool use, right? We can look at some of the oldest, at least to this point, oldest known stone tools that have been recovered from paleoanthropological or archaeological sites, however you want to phrase it, going back maybe as far as close to 3.5 million years ago is whenever we can really start to try to better understand this interaction between human biology and things like cognition and culture, right? And try to understand how maybe biology influences the capacity for culture, and then how culture in turn influences and affects our biology. So, based on kind of the current consensus among archaeologists, paleoanthropologists, it seems that sort of the general sort of kind of the full toolkit, we might say, of culture was probably present by about 65,000 years ago. And here we have, I love our, caveman from the Geico commercials. And these over here are just some of these kind of core components of culture, particularly with respect to being able to transmit culture from one generation to the next, right? Without what we might call slippage, right? Where we lose those things from one generation to the next, right? Just some other examples sort of from prehistory. There's a really interesting site in South Africa called Blombos Cave, where Archaeologists have uncovered some of the earliest evidence of um, um, abstract shapes being carved and drawn on things like, so here this is just a fragment of ochre that has geometric shapes that have been carved on it, dates to around 70,000 years ago. At that same site, even in some older levels that date closer to 100,000 years ago, um, folks have found like shell beads with like ochre pigment and alongside seal bones, like the bones of seals, which archaeologists think the folks there were probably using the seal fat to mix with the ochre to make the pigment that they were drawing with. Um, I imagine a lot of you guys might be familiar with some of the just amazing cave paintings from some sites in France. So this is a replica of one of the paintings in the Chauvet cave in France, dates to around 35,000 years ago. Right, we have another example. This is from a really well-known series of caves in sort of northern Spain. So this is a polychrome painting of a bison 20 to 30,000 years ago. And really interesting, just sort of, breaking out of that sort of that idea where, so much of this stuff may have been happening during the Upper Paleolithic in Europe. We have sites recently discovered on the island of Sulawesi. So this is one of the small Indonesian islands, sort of just south of Borneo, and a cave there are at least now to date the earliest animal drawings and paintings that we know of. These have been dated to about 45,000 years ago. Really interesting stuff. So we've got some different pigs, and you guys can see the outlines of the hands as well. These are, culture allows us to adapt. It might increase our survival or reproductive success, or they might just arise out of convenience. The bone needle probably first appears around 50,000 years ago, or like in that Upper Paleolithic period. Probably just radically, altered human history in terms of, if you're able to sew and tailor clothing to keep yourself warm, you can expand into different environments. Then again, we have cultural adaptation such that I don't have to move around too much, and I can just use the remote or ask Alexa or Google Home to do something for me. Certainly, I think just after the years of study, especially from wildlife biologists, it looks more and more, and also by primatologists, I should say, as it relates to anthropology. It's hard to make the argument now that culture is completely just sort of unique to humans. We have evidence of aspects of culture in the wild, in particular, and observing non-human primates like chimpanzees, where you see novel behaviors introduced by members of a community, and then those are learned by others and passed on to other generations. But maybe the one thing that kind of, again, sets human culture aside from other aspects of culture is that it's cumulative, right? That we don't have much loss of that culture from one generation to the next. So what about culture today? Well, it certainly when we think about culture, it allows us to sort of open our eyes and take a broader perspective on sort of the sweep of human history. So, addressing and confronting the legacies of Western imperialism, colonialism across the world, it compels us to sort of really face cultural diversity, right? And try to, answer that question, can we understand another group and their cultural patterns, norms, values um, on its own terms, right? Without sort of trying to judge based on what we feel is good, normal, moral, etc., from our own cultural experience, right? Looking at something like female genital mutilation, right? This is, like an example like this is a good example where sort of this idea of cultural relativism and not judging to better understand is very challenging, especially when it sort of butts up against advocates for human rights, right? So we look at something like FGM, and it might sort of at first glance from our perspective seem abhorrent, but at the same token, someone looking at from the outside at something like male circumcision in our society might think the same thing. But all this ties to, again, sort of how culture is transmitted and how it changes and interacts today. Things like trying to understand who owns the past, who controls the narrative of the future. This is just a heartbreaking picture of the ancient site of Palmyra in Syria, where ISIS destroyed a really well-known temple, the Temple of Baal, in 2015. And again, this isn't just something that sort of happens in far off lands, right? Culture is dynamic and it's not shared by all 100%. And so there's always ebbs and flows and push and pull, even within a society that we might think of as sharing a culture, right? So this isn't just something that we sort of see in far off lands. It occurs within our own societies as well. So just to, I know we're at time, I just want to cap off with two alternative definitions of culture. One here from the late Clifford Geertz. So about 100 years after Tyler gave his definition, this is one that I've always enjoyed from Geertz. Believing that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he has spun, right? So culture is the webs, and we create culture, but it also is the thing that sort of we become immersed in, right? We exist within these webs of significance that we ourselves create. And then just to kind of call back to the title of the presentation, I really liked this definition of culture. It's a little bit more recent, by Spencer Oatley in 2008. Culture is a fuzzy set of basic assumptions and values, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not going to read that all, but you guys can take a look at that. I thought that was a really good definition that provides sort of the flexibility that we now know that culture encompasses. Some additional resources for anybody that might want to access the slideshow afterwards. And that's all. I just want to say thank you guys again so much, and thank Courtney for inviting me to present to you guys. So I don't see any questions in the Q&A. Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, we got a question in the audience here.
Sure.
I've seen things happen just in the past few weeks that I'm just wondering if they're cultural changes, and they are not good changes. They're trying to separate people from they're changing our lives and we have nothing to say about it, it seems like. It's just happened in the past few weeks. And it's scary. I know that's not a question, but
So what I would
how fast do these things happen?
So what I would say to that is that I certainly appreciate I can appreciate that sentiment, but I think that is it's just an example of some of what we've been talking about here. In particular, that culture is not something that's static. It's a dynamic system that isn't a monolith, and there's always going to be variation within a society, however we might want to define that. You know, if we're talking about a society within maybe a nation state, there's always going to be variation and push, pull, conflict, and negotiation around which cultural norms are going to be mainstream, which ones of those fall out of the mainstream. So it's not something that I think that we should be necessarily surprised to see.
Well, thank you very much, Trey, for presenting this. And thank you all to our audience, both here and on Zoom, for joining us. And thank you for putting up with my technological challenges, let's say, for making this happen. So please join us again next week for Chris Towers' talk. And Trey, thank you very much.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, everyone.